Good morning, nerds. It is I. I have been playing Cyberpunk RED since only a few weeks after it came out, but so far I've not made a single video about it. I had planned to, but that one is currently resting on the cutting room floor where it belongs. That being said, inspiration finally hit me, and so this week we'll be talking about Cyberpunk RED's combat system, and why it works so well. But before we chip in and explore this game's mechanics, I have 3 buttons I'd love it if you'd click, and those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. Now, in the interest of transparency, I do need to give a disclaimer. I have worked with Artel on a volunteer basis. I was previously part of their Balancetown gang doing playtesting for them, and I have received a number of free products from them, both physical and digital. However, my relationship with Talsorian has ended, 2 years ago now? So everything that follows here is just my own opinion. So, to make sure we're all up to speed, let's do a quick run through of how Cyberpunk RED's mechanics actually work, as without this knowledge, this video will be rather confusing. At the most fundamental level, all characters have 10 stats that are rated from 1 to 8, and something like 66 skills that are rated from 0 to 10. Stats and skills are added together for the purpose of die rolls, and stats do occasionally affect other things, most notably the body and will stats affect HP. HP does start pretty high in Cyberpunk, but it almost never goes up after the start of play. There is no extra HP when you level up. That just doesn't happen. As I said, stats and skills are added together for skill checks, along with 1d10 and any modifiers that may apply to the roll. If you roll a natural 10, you roll another d10 and add it to the total, and if you roll natural 1, you roll another d10 and subtract it from the total. This gives CPR's dice maths a curve that is both consistent and swingy at the same time. And yeah, a quick note on modifiers, Cyberpunk RED does use them, you will need to add and subtract all of them, but honestly, there aren't that many. I should also note that, in addition to d10s for the main skill checks, you also use d6s for damage rolls and critical injury rolls. There are no d4s, d8s, d12s, yada yadas. And finally, for our quick rundown here, each PC belongs to one of 10 roles. These are the classes that the game uses, each of which has a level from 1 to 10, although PCs usually start at 4, in recognition of the life experience they're expected to have before they start play. These bonuses, while all for the most part useful, and all entirely unique to each role, do play quite the backseat in the mechanics. Most of the heavy lifting here is done by the skill system, especially for things like weapons. There are no class-based weapon proficiencies. You learn to stab and chip by putting ranks in the appropriate skills. But what about the combat system itself? Well, good thing you asked. Combat begins by rolling initiative. It's just 1d10 plus reflexes. And unlike previous editions, you only roll it once. Although you may actually have to do tiebreaker rolls if multiple people get the same initiative. On each character's turn, they get an action and a move. That's it. There are no reactions, there are no bonus actions. There is the concept of rate of fire, but that's about it. Speaking of actions, each can be used to make a single skill check, 1 or 2 attacks depending on the weapon's rate of fire, to double move, or for some other fun thing like net running abilities, grappling, you get the idea. Cyberpunk RED does not have an armor class, although it does have armor. When you roll to hit in CPR, you make your attack roll either against a range DV from a range table based on your weapon type and the distance, or if you're making a melee attack or a ranged attack against some high reflex characters, well then you roll it opposed against their evasion skill. Once you hit, you roll a pool of d6s for damage and then subtract armor. Any damage left over after this subtraction is deducted from HP, as you would probably expect. But the important detail here is that armor is also damaged. It gets ablated too, in a process called ablation. But if the total damage is equal to or under the armor stopping power, or SP, then you lose no HP and you don't get your armor ablated. This is what I and other players refer to as a ping, because it pings off the armor. And if 2 or more 6s are rolled on those damage dice, then you roll another 2d6 for a critical injury. These are a lot of fun, for whoever rolled the crit. Now, even at this early stage, I have some comments to make about how this all works. Both player turns and combat rounds as a whole in Cyberpunk RED are very quick. There's not really a lot you can do on your turn. Theoretically, a single turn could take up to 12 rolls if you are using a rate of fire to your weapon that is being resisted both times with the evasion skill, both you and your opponent get nat 10s and nat 1s, and you hit both times and get critical injuries both times. Yes, you can get to 12 rolls, but that will rarely happen. And the truth is, because the actual weapons and abilities themselves in Cyberpunk RED have so few bells and whistles most of the time, it's very easy to get a sense of familiarity of, okay, I roll this, I use this skill, I roll this many damage dice, I move this far every turn, and because of that, you can get through a round very, very quickly. Like, routinely in under a minute. Now that being said, characters in Cyberpunk RED do have fairly high armor and HP, especially the player characters, which means that characters can be a bit spongy and combat can take quite a few rounds. However, because those rounds themselves are so quick, combat won't feel like it takes nearly as long as it actually does. I remember when I started my current campaign, and we finally had our first combat in the second session. It took us 2 hours. I was the only one who had played Cyberpunk RED previous to this, so I was teaching a big old band of noobs how the system worked. 2 hours then, while certainly a long combat, is not too surprising. However, what was interesting is that one of my players told me after the session, you know what, I know that took 2 hours, but it sure didn't feel like it. Which, as far as compliments to the system go, is pretty good. Now, overall, I say that Cyberpunk RED has very few bells and whistles for characters and equipment, but there are some, and it's worth going over them here. The first thing to point out is aimed shots. By default, all melee and ranged attacks are made against center mass. This may seem a bit bland to players of Cyberpunk 2020, but it works. However, if you want to shoot at, say, the head, the arms, or the legs, you still can. You have to make an aimed shot. This is a rate of fire 1 attack with a -8 modifier, and if you hit, there are a bunch of fun special benefits to it. If you want to know what those are, then read the rulebook. The other default for most attacks is that they are 1 shot or 1 swing at a time. If you'd rather just squeeze the trigger and let bullets spray out though, well, that's what the auto-fire skill is for. There is no burst mode in Cyberpunk RED, which is an oft complained about trait, but there are 2 other things you can do. There is auto-fire and suppressive fire. With auto-fire, if you make a very tricky skill check, using a skill that is difficult to level up against a stupidly high difficulty, then you can do humongous damage to a target by just spraying them with bullets. If that isn't quite your thing, then you can still use the auto-fire skill, but versus the concentration of everyone in a 25-meter radius. Anyone who fails the opposed roll is suppressed. On their next turn, they must move towards the nearest piece of cover. If there is no cover within their normal move range, they must use their action to double move. If there is no cover within double their move range, they have to get as far away from you as they can, and then just stand around feeling scared. No matter what happens, they will end up losing a turn, and they can't come out of cover until the turn after. As far as other weapon-specific abilities go, shotguns can fire either slugs, which function like normal ammo, or shells, which do a lesser damage, very close-range AoE attack, which is surprisingly useful the handful of times that I've ever managed to use it. If you want a bigger area of effect, then use a grenade. They are very good, there are a lot of types of them, and I recommend all of them. Grappling also exists, and unlike in D&D 5e, it actually does something. You can choke people unconscious, throw them to the ground, equip them as human shields. There are so many fun things that you can do with just a quick little grab. And finally, Cyberpunk RED does have a lot of rules for exotic weapons and special ammo types like armor piercing, rubber, incendiary, smoke ammo, stuff like that. These all give their own special abilities like armor piercing ammo, ablating armor by 2 each time you pierce armor, and exotic weapons have abilities that range from being rate of fire 2 variants of normally rate of fire 1 weapons, to being able to completely bypass armor if it's below a certain SP, to being usable to get bonuses for your fashion rolls. Nope, I am not joking about that last one. I should also note that this has been one of the main areas of growth in Cyberpunk since it was first released 3.5 years ago. The DLCs and supplement books since then have given us a lot of new weapon options, and all of them are pretty good. The nice thing about all of these bells and whistles and other fun features is that they're pretty much entirely optional. You don't need to use auto-fire to get the benefits of an assault rifle. You don't need to use slugs to get the benefit of a shotgun. And things like brawling abilities or martial arts, which I forgot to mention just now, that again, you only need to worry about as of when you need them. Unlike in, say, D&D or Pathfinder, where your character at level 1 begins with a bunch of weird abilities, all of which you have to immediately learn how to use, and none of which work anything like the other abilities of the other player characters. When you start out in Cyberpunk, you're probably using the basic weapons out of the core rulebook, where the main distinguishing factors are range table, damage, and rate of fire. Now bear in mind, all of those are pretty meaningful, but they also use a common language and rule set, which means that it's very easy to teach players how they work. That being said though, if that was all you had, then Cyberpunk's combat system would be incredibly bland, and this is where all the special combat tricks, like fancy ammo, exotic weapons, martial arts, all of that come to fruition. Once you have mastered the basics, these are the tools that you can use to bring your combat game up to the next level. And they really don't slow the game down that much even when you do add them. I mean, for crying out loud, most of the grapple actions don't require you to roll. If you choke someone, you just deal your body in HP directly to them. No roll, no faffing with armor, just subtract your body from their HP. It's that simple. But now let's move on to something a bit more complicated, and that's the rules for things like movement and range in Cyberpunk RED. As far as units of measurement go, Cyberpunk uses meters and yards interchangeably, which is kind of weird when you think about it, but I'm pretty sure the designers actually don't want you to. Personally, I use meters. The rules work the same either way, just fudge the discrepancy in distance. Beyond this, Cyberpunk RED does things in increments of 2 meters, which it also uses as the size of a single grid square. And yes, you will want grid squares for this game. Now, I have run Cyberpunk RED Theatre of the Mind. You can absolutely do it. However, I am also the sort of person who is perfectly capable of visualizing a mental grid in my head and projecting the player characters and NPCs onto that grid. Indeed, this was how I ran RPGs ever since I first started them. But when I joined a West Marches server for Cyberpunk RED and then started GMing for that server, I was expected to do so on the Roll20 virtual tabletop. And given that everybody else in that server was using maps, I ended up using myself. In fact, I ended up making them. And I found that I enjoyed making maps so much that I actually now prefer using grids and maps to Theatre of the Mind, which for any of you who know me in my real life is a very strange position for me to be in. I'll put some of the maps that I've made for recent sessions up on the side here, because believe me, I am rather proud of these. Personally, my recommendation for Theatre of the Mind is to lean heavily on the range increments from the range table. Do a rough calculation in your head of how many moves it would take each player or each NPC to move from one range increment to another, and use that as the basis for your Theatre of the Mind. Don't be too precise unless you really enjoy visualizing mental grids. But getting back to my point, characters can move 2 meters or 1 square per point of their move stat. The move stat doesn't do anything else in this game, which some people like and some people don't. I should also note that prone characters cannot move at all, unless they use an action to stand up first. This move is both bold and controversial, but it serves a purpose. The point is to make you make difficult decisions about your action economy. Given that there are no other effects to being prone, like say negative modifiers to hit or bonuses to being attacked, if you allowed say half-speed crawling, then the prone condition would lose a lot of its kick. But speaking of attacking and being attacked, unless you're attacking a high reflex character or you're making a melee attack, you will be using the range table. You look up your weapon type, the range band that you're in, and that gives you a number. You have to roll higher than that number, or you will miss. Each weapon type, from pistol to SMG to bow to rocket launcher, all have their own optimal ranges. And no, not everyone gets a good TV at point blank. Put simply, if you're using a two-handed rifle with a very long barrel, where you have to make aim corrections with pretty much your entire body, at short range that's rather unwieldy. On the other hand, a pistol that is nice and compact and isn't too difficult to switch your aim with is very good at close range, but due to things like lower muzzle velocity, it simply doesn't have the effectiveness at longer ranges. A byproduct of this is that there is a lot of jockeying of position in combat, as everyone is trying to get into their own optimal range and out of other people's. And there's also a lot of characters trying to move into cover. Cover in Cyberpunk RED completely blocks attacks, just outright. It is incredibly binary and incredibly simplistic. It does, however, have HP that can be reduced by damaging it. And indeed, if you destroy a piece of cover with an area of effect attack like a grenade, then anyone behind that cover takes full damage from that area attack. Note that for single target attacks there is no overpenetration with cover, so destroying walls with pistol rounds is not very efficient. Now the first thing this does is make you want to carry grenades. Believe me, grenades are very useful in this game. The other factor here is that it encourages even more jockeying for position. And so, while movement in Cyberpunk RED is very simple, like I said earlier, you have a move stat, which is the number of squares you can move, you have one move action each turn, and you can use your action for a second, but the system is set up to create some very interesting implications from these rules, which is what you want to see from a core mechanic. Beyond the desire to move around that the range table creates, it also makes players more likely to try and switch weapons, if say they get too close for their rifle or too far for their pistol. Which leans further into the action economy because while you can draw a weapon without spending any of your actions, and you can also drop a weapon on the ground without spending an action, if you want to stow a weapon to, say, use later, that is an action, which means that movement and the action economy combine very cleverly together. I should note that a lot of the rules here are very controversial. The range table is regarded by some as very clumsy, as pretty much every time you make a ranged attack, you have to consult it. Unless you do what I did and memorize most of the important stuff. I'm gonna be honest, if you're using a sniper rifle or a rocket launcher, I am going to need to look it up, but for pistols, bows, shotguns, assault rifles, SMGs, I can do all of those in my head at this point. But of course, that won't be possible for everyone, including the game's designers, who apparently do still need to check the range table whenever they run combat. The other controversial mechanic here is cover. As noted earlier, it is a binary yes or no mechanic. There are no, say, 2-hit penalties for half cover, and a lot of players and GMs have complained about these rules over the years. And you know what, if you want to change them, change them. I haven't, and that's because, like it or not, they just work. They certainly aren't very ambitious rules, but they do everything they intend to, and so as GM, as long as you actually use the cover rules, you put cover on your maps in places that will meaningfully block sightlines, you will get your players moving a lot more. But no matter how much running for cover and evading you do, sooner or later your character is going to get hit. As previously, you roll a bunch of d6s for damage, and anything that exceeds your armor is subtracted from your HP. An important note with armor is that melee weapons ignore half armor. If an enemy has, say, 11 SP, which is the average for light armor jack, then they'll only get to subtract 6 from the damage caused by a melee weapon. As long as you're doing even 1 point of damage per attack, armor will be whittled down over time, and eventually it will provide little to no protection at all. An important note with armor is that melee weapons ignore half armor. If an enemy has, say, 11 SP, which is the average for light armor jack, then they'll only get to subtract 6 from the damage caused by a melee weapon. If you roll at least 2 6s on your damage roll, then you get a critical injury. There's a 2d6 table for this, one for the head, one for the body, and all of the outcomes here provide a bunch of penalties for the character that receives the injury. These can affect certain rolls, they can inflict damage if you move too far, or they can increase your penalty for death saves. But we aren't quite at the point of death yet. If you simply lose more than half your HP, you take a -2 to everything. This does trigger a bit of a death spiral. Some people like that, some people don't. Personally, I actually like it. It makes combat go more quickly, and it's a good psychological impetus for players to take good care of their characters. Once you reach 0 HP, then the fun begins. You don't actually go unconscious, at least not yet. But you do take a -4 to all of your actions, and a -6 to your move stat. To top it off, at the start of your turn you have to roll a death save. This means rolling 1d10 plus penalties under your body, and each successive round that you do this, your penalty goes up by 1. Eventually, death saves will become impossible and your character will succumb to their injuries. Given the high HP and high armor of most characters, and the very brutal death mechanics, the fate of a doomed character in Cyberpunk RED is much like how Ernest Hemingway described bankruptcy. Characters die gradually, and then suddenly. But there is always a chance of survival, and I've experienced of this from my third ever character. My first character was an exec from another campaign, the second actually died in his first session, and the third character I made was a medtech. He was going to be part of a hit squad to assassinate a businessman, and he did his job at this pretty well. He got nice and close to that businessman and chopped off his head. Unfortunately, doing this meant coming into the firing line of his bodyguards, and while those guards couldn't save their boss, they could avenge him, kinetically, with large amounts of lead. An alarmingly high amount of which ended up in my medtech, and he went down to 0 HP. However, being conscious, and being a medtech, he was able to stabilize himself, despite the -4 penalty. Unfortunately, in Cyberpunk RED, when you get stabilized, you also go unconscious for an entire minute. And one round being 3 seconds in Cyberpunk, that meant that my character was basically out of action for whatever remained of the combat. And so, my character's allies had to rescue me and drag my sleeping form out of the apartment and away to safety. So yes, you can survive being put to 0 in Cyberpunk RED, but by golly, you need good first aid skills. The first detail that I want to note here is that most NPCs deliberately have low armor and HP, which means that they'll go down in a shot or two. On the other hand, player characters and more powerful NPCs can take quite a few hits to take down. This does lead to complaints about player characters being spongy, but on the flip side, it means they're quite survivable. Though I wouldn't really worry too much about the sponginess. The truth is, damage in Cyberpunk RED is much stickier than it is in other RPG systems. Because you have the wound penalties and the critical injuries, getting shot has a much more concrete impact than it does in, say, D&D 5e or Pathfinder. D&D 5e here is particularly guilty. The fact you get all of your HP back after 8 hours of sleep means that there are very few ways as a GM to lay the pain on your players in a lasting way. On the other hand, in Cyberpunk, if you get put down to 1 HP and have, say, a dismembered hand on a foreign object, first off, unless you have a medtech in the party, you're now on the hook for 1,000 EBs of medical expenses. which is probably going to be your entire payout. And if you're thinking that being put to 1 HP and 2 critical injuries is in some way brutal or unrealistic, I have done worse. Back in that West Marches server, I once ran a scenario where the players had to fight a bunch of Arasaka goons to rescue a hostage. Now, in the course of this combat, the Arasaka goons rolled very well on their damage. One player character ended up with a dismembered leg, and she was the lucky one, because there was another character who ended up with a bit more than that. His character got a dismembered arm, a dismembered hand, a dismembered leg, a foreign object, and was also put to 0 HP. What makes this all especially galling is what that player said to me before the session. I had jumped into the voice call a bit early to set things up, and while I was working away, he dropped in and said the following. Hey, I just want you to know, I've never played a tabletop RPG before, and I'm so excited! I am genuinely amazed that player ever turned up to a second session. But believe it or not, he did. And a third, a fourth, and a fifth. I haven't spoken to him in a while, but I'm pretty sure that despite that first experience, he still plays tabletop RPGs. So yeah, do not underestimate the ability that GMs have to absolutely plaster their players without needing to kill them. Especially when you consider that healing in Cyberpunk RED is what I would consider medium-paced. It's faster than, say, the per-week healing of RuneQuest or Pendragon, but much slower than the heal everything in a night of D&D 5e. In Cyberpunk RED, you heal your body in HP per day. There are ways to increase this, but not that many, which means if you get beat up in a fight, you will actually need a couple of days to convalesce. And of course, player characters can absolutely die if they do stupid things, as 2 of my players have done in this campaign, which is why they're now both running around with replacement characters. That being said, Cyberpunk RED is not a perfect combat system. I wouldn't even want you to think that. I have deliberately interspersed this video with common critiques of the system, but here are some of my personal ones. Characters with 8 reflexes in Cyberpunk RED can evade ranged attacks with the evasion skill, rather than being dependent on the range table. This is busted, as even having an evasion skill slightly higher than your opponent's weapon skill can be enough to make the odds to hit something like 20%. And so yeah, there is a huge difference in survivability between PCs that don't have 8 reflexes and those that do. Now, Artelsorian partially rectified this in Black Chrome by creating a neural-aware option called the Reflex Coprocessor that lets you evade ranged attacks without 8 reflexes. This is nice as it makes the ability more available, but it doesn't affect the issues with the ability in and of themselves. The next complaint that I have is that even if the rounds themselves are usually pretty quick in Cyberpunk, it can take a lot of rounds to get through a combat. The longest I've had was somewhere in the range of 20, but that's unusual. 6 to 8 rounds, on the other hand, most certainly isn't. Now, as I said earlier, because of the pace of individual rounds, combat feels pretty quick. But that doesn't change the objective fact that it can take hours, and that can eat into your schedule, and into the other things you want to do that session. Another complaint is that while letting melee weapons halve armor SP is great for balancing them and making them useful, melee combat itself is not nearly as exciting as ranged combat. A common critique of D&D style combat is that it just evolves into 2 people slap fighting each other, hacking back and forth without moving or doing anything interesting. And the truth is that melee combat in Cyberpunk RED is exactly the same. It's only the third-person cover shooter-esque ranged combat that makes things seem interesting. Beyond this, it probably is true that PCs are a bit too spongy. It can take either beefing up NPC stats, or just spamming them with grenades to lay any pain on at all. It's pretty easy to build a super ultra combat munchkin character, and to basically just avoid damage in general, especially with 8 reflexes and a high evasion skill. But on the other hand, the slow healing, the need to repair armor after combats, and the critical injury rules mean that PCs can only usually handle 1 to 2 combats at a time before they need multiple days to heal. This really constrains the way you design adventures. Big, long dungeon crawls aren't really an option. And so throughout my time GMing Cyberpunk, I've usually built my adventures around single, big, set-piece combats, as that's what seems to work best for the system. And finally, compared to Cyberpunk 2020, which admittedly I've only ever played 1 session of, there simply are less options. There are fewer bells and whistles, there is a much shorter list of modifiers, and those modifiers are often vaguer and thus a bit harder to use. Now, on the one hand, this does serve on arithmetic, but on the other hand, I'm pretty good at arithmetic. I do find myself being the designated calculator at whichever table I'm sitting at. So the lack of modifiers does make combat a bit more boring and add a bit fewer options compared to previous editions. and that does need to be called out. I don't actually have very many house rules for Cyberpunk RED, but I do use a couple here and there, so I'll talk about them here. The first is not really a combat-specific one, but it's one that I use a lot in general, so I'll mention it anyway, and that's the luck roll. Basically, if you want to see something good or not so good happens, you have a player roll 1d10 equal or under their maximum luck. This isn't affected by the number of luck points they've spent, it's just a generic roll to see what happens. Another generic rules change that I've made has been extra effects for natural 1s and natural 10s. If you roll a natural 10 and you succeed, you get an extra bonus. If you roll a natural 1 and you fail, then you get some sort of fumble effect. Now, given that there are two conditions here, that you must succeed on the natural 10 for a good thing and must fail on the natural 1 for a bad thing, while there can be theoretically a 10% chance of each happening, if you have very high or very low skills, that can change. The third change that I've made is a slight change to the wording of the torn muscle critical injury. As it stands, if you receive it, you take a -2 to melee attacks. But if you want a melee character, that does nothing. And so, after a player complained about how boring it was, I said sure, let's change it. And so now it also inflicts a -2 to evasion, which makes it a much more interesting critical injury. I don't generally have house rules for evasion or cover rules. I've tried these with previous groups, and I've not seen anything that works well enough for my liking, but you are free to suggest options in the comments down below. So, to round things out, I do genuinely understand why people do complain about Cyberpunk RED's combat. Compared to Cyberpunk 2020, it is a much simpler system, and that means that it has fewer options and fewer tricks to master. It's also a very video gamey system. It uses a lot of abstract rules, and a lot of assumptions that it makes about combat are very unrealistic. But as far as combat rules go, I do still think it's good. It has just the right balance of fast pace, interesting decisions, and fun abilities to tickle my fancy. And so this is why, over the last 3.5 years, I've spent so much time with the system. If you're watching this trying to figure out the sort of system that I'd like, well, now you know. As a GM, I like my combats fast, not because I dislike combat, but because I actually feel that that helps with the pacing and tension of the scene itself. I do like having the decisions you make in combat be more interesting than, I hit him and then wait 15 minutes to hit him again. And every now and then, I like my characters to be defined by more than just a few numbers on a sheet, and to have a few clever rules here and there to make them and what they can do more unique. That may not be for you, but it is for me, and it's my channel, so suck it. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. Have you tried Cyberpunk RED, and what did you think of the rules? If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel. And once more, thank you all so much for watching, stay awesome chums, and farewell.